give us your take on the action that we saw by the DOJ today. What is the significance and where could it lead?
Well, there had been some question about whether they would actually skip over the Fifth Circuit and go straight to the Supreme Court. Given the stakes here, I think there had been some concern about whether the Fifth Circuit would drag its feet and issue an order in time, given really the 7-day time period we were talking about this week, where the judge's order in Texas doesn't go into effect right away. They gave that time for the Justice Department to appeal. And so I think there had been some concern about whether the Fifth Circuit would rule fast enough. And now that they have filed the appeal, they make it very clear they want the court to move fast so that if, in fact, the Fifth Circuit doesn't give DOJ what it wants, it still has time to get to the Supreme Court before this order goes into effect on Saturday, Kristen.
And Laura, let's talk big picture here, because you have the Texas ruling, which essentially halts the use of mifepristone, and then the Washington state ruling, which contradicts that in 17 states. Undoubtedly, this is headed for the Supreme Court. What's the timing? When do you think we could see it go to the high court? And when do you think we could have a final decision here?
Well, it partly depends on what happens in the Fifth Circuit. Now that DOJ and Danco, the manufacturer of this pill, have filed their appeal, what you might see in a first instance is what's known as an administrative stay. And all that means is that the Fifth Circuit is putting a pause on everything. It would wipe out Judge Kaczmarek's Saturday deadline, in effect, to allow everyone to have their say. Everyone would file their motion papers in court, and then the case would proceed. But essentially, it would maintain the status quo. And so you don't have that looming deadline over you. If, in fact, the Fifth Circuit puts that stay in place, then that would slow things down a bit. Obviously, the plaintiffs would fight it, but it could potentially slow things down a bit. If, in fact, the Fifth Circuit does not do that, then I think you're going to see some very quick movement to the Supreme Court very soon this week, probably as early as Wednesday or Thursday, Kristen.
And Laura, can you break down right now where we are? Where does access stand if you wanted to try to purchase this pill?
Well, right now, it's really just the status quo, as if everything was in existence on Friday afternoon. So if you live in a state where access to mifepristone was already granted and there was no other rule on the books, then that continues. The interesting thing to note here is that the Washington state case, which that federal judge issued, only applies to those 18 blue states, because those are the ones that sued over it. Their Democratic AGs sued over it. Almost a mirror image to the Texas lawsuit. They were so worried about the Texas lawsuit, that's why they did it. But that case doesn't include some of the biggest states. That case doesn't include New York or California. So if you're a woman in New York or California, you would presumably be governed by the Texas suit, whereas a woman in Illinois would be governed by the lawsuit in Washington. And so it's sort of a patchwork and a bit of a mess for people trying to figure out which rule applies to them, and hence again why this could be headed to the Supreme Court quickly.
Laura, thank you for helping us sort through what is such a complicated legal situation. Monica, let me go to you at the White House, because the administration has already had to clarify what Javier Becerra said earlier today, making it very clear that they will not simply ignore the ruling from the Texas court. But how far can the White House go? Take me inside some of your conversations. What are they saying?
Yeah, and this is something that the Health and Human Services Secretary, Javier Becerra, said yesterday on the Sunday shows. He said, quote, everything is on the table. And it came in the context of some high-profile Democrats saying that the White House should come out and fully ignore this potential ban on this crucial medication for terminating pregnancy. And instead, the White House essentially had to ask HHS and others to walk back that language when it comes to the administration specifically. Of course, lawmakers can have their own opinions here, and many of those Democrats do, and they diverge with what we just heard from the White House press secretary, who I asked about all of this. And she said, to be very clear, the White House and President Biden don't want to set a precedent of saying we're not going to obey or listen to something that would be a binding order. They don't want to go down that path. So they are saying they, of course, intend to fight this. That has been their position since this ruling came out on Friday. But they're going to do so, they say, in the legal system and in the courts. And so that does set up this larger conversation about the strategy here. And that is why in conversations with officials today, we continue to hear a White House that is bracing, they say, for a very long legal battle. So even though they would support essentially the Department of Justice if it does make that decision, as Laura was reporting, to go to the Supreme Court sooner in this process while on the separate track trying to get it blocked in the Fifth Circuit, they're also not necessarily saying that that's something they want to see happen immediately. immediately. They think this could really take a long time. But Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary, when asked, said she actually has confidence that if this went to the Supreme Court, they would win. When asked why she has that kind of confidence, given the conservative-leaning majority currently in the Supreme Court, she said simply that she believes the facts of this case are on their side, specifically from the perspective of the FDA and what this would mean for plenty of other very common drugs and medications that Americans take every day that agency has deemed safe and effective. Kristen.
Great job pressing her today, Monica, to get those answers and that clarification.